Welcome to the Phillip Jordan Football Podcast. Phillip Jordan and his football friends discuss the latest headlines on the field and off. Whether it's during the season in the fall, countdown to signing day, or on the road to the draft, Phillip has you covered. Now let's kick it off with your host, Phillip Jordan.
Welcome, everybody, to the Phillip Jordan Football Podcast here on July 30th, 2020. Thank you for checking out the show and making it a part of your day. My name is Phillip Jordan, the host. I am from Last Word on College Football, 96.9 The Legend in Dothan, Alabama, where I am the in-studio host and producer for Dothan Wolves Football. Got a fantastic show planned for you guys today. Going to be talking Big Ten football with Dustin Schutte. He is the managing editor of Saturday Tradition, where they cover Big Ten football, so we got a lot to talk about. We'll look at the decision the Big Ten made a few weeks ago to go conference only. Was that a knee-jerk reaction? Was it a smart move? We'll get Dustin's thoughts there, and we'll jump all over to Big Ten, talk about Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Get who he thinks are some, obviously, the teams that can compete with Ohio State, and also some surprise teams in the Big Ten. Before we do all that, let you guys know you can find me and the podcast. You can find me on all your favorite social media platforms at PJordanSEC. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all your favorite podcast platforms. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe, rate, and review. You can also find the show on YouTube, the Phillip Jordan Sports YouTube channel. Please hit that subscribe button, like the videos, and leave a comment there. When it comes to YouTube comments and reviews on Apple Podcasts, you leave those comments and reviews. I will read them on a future edition of the show. And you can always email me at sportstalkphilipjordan@gmail.com. All right, let's jump into it. Let's talk some Big Ten football. Everybody joining me on the podcast today is Dustin Schutte. He is the managing editor over Saturday Tradition, covering Big Ten football. And Dustin, I told you this off air, but I do appreciate you taking out the time to come on the podcast and talk some Big Ten football.
Hey, it's always a pleasure, and I appreciate you having me on, Phillip. Always good to talk football. Absolutely.
This is what this podcast is about. I have a sickness, or I guess a disease. I don't know what you want to call it. Just love football all the time. It's just I always love talking about it. I hope we do get some football this coming fall with everything going on. But yeah, I guess that's where I start. And it seems like it's kind of like mandatory with these episodes. When you try to talk about the upcoming season, you do have to talk about, obviously, the pandemic and what's going on. What is your confidence level right now as we're sitting here in late July about if we will have a college football season or not?
It's been interesting because, you go back to late May, early June, and it's kind of like a roller coaster, right? We have a wave of positivity when you look at the NCAA lifting the moratorium on organized team activities, and it looks like everybody's excited about getting back, and it looks like potentially we're going to have a full schedule, and then all of a sudden there's this huge drop and a decline in that optimism and confidence. And now it's just kind of twisting and turning almost daily, and weekly. And what we've kind of focused on recently has been the number of positive test cases out of certain schools. But really what we need to look at is, how are these schools handling these situations? And I think overwhelmingly what we're seeing, Clemson had 50 student athletes test positive, and a couple days ago they reported that there are no active cases. Maryland had 12 student athletes who tested positive a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and they're down to 0 positive tests. So I am increasingly optimistic. I wouldn't say that I'm 95 or 100% confident. I would say I'm 65, 70% confident we'll have a season, just because it looks like a lot of schools right now are handling this the right way. And that doesn't mean there won't be some hiccups or some issues along the way, but I do think that we're going to get this figured out, and we'll get football in some way, shape, form, or fashion here in the next couple months.
Yeah, and then a couple weeks ago, the Big Ten, obviously then followed by the Pac-12, made the big news that they were going conference only. And it's kind of like one of the things, I saw it, and I wasn't shocked that one of the conferences or any of them or all of them would do that because it's just an easier way to legislate things. You run the conference. You can set out parameters, guidelines for how you want to deal with things. But you also look at it now, where a few weeks later, you still have the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12 they still are kind of acting like they want to have non-conference games. So how are you feeling now, a few weeks separated from the Big Ten's announcement? Do you think they maybe jumped the gun too a little early, or it was still the right move?
Yeah, and I think that's a complicated question, because I think you can look at this and say it was a little too early, especially when you look at what the Big 12 did, right? Recently, Oklahoma and Kansas have scheduled FCS opponents for week 0. So they're looking to move games up to August 29th, and they're still looking at a potentially playing their non-conference schedule. So I think in that, if the Big 12 and other conferences play a non-conference schedule, I think you look back and say, hey, the Big 10 may have jumped the gun on this. Maybe they were a little premature in their decision-making. At the same time, I think what Kevin Warren was doing, and you remember, this is a guy who's been on the job 6 or 7 months, and what a crazy 6 or 7 months he's had to endure. He has to make that tough call, and I think that his mindset and probably a lot of presidents and athletic directors is, if this is going to give us the best shot to play football this season, considering all the money that's at stake, all the jobs that are at stake, the scholarships, student athletes' health, and their opportunity to perform this season if they so choose, I think that they thought the earlier that they could get this mandated and eliminate non-conference games, the better opportunity that they had. Now, you look at this from the scheduling standpoint, you look at Iowa State gets canceled. Ball State, Indiana gets canceled, and some of those other games that are in-state. So you look at it and you're like, well, why can't those two teams play? But you're right, from the conference standpoint, they can it gives them more flexible scheduling. It allows them to be on the same page with protocols and guidelines. And, I think that this was the best chance to get Big Ten football played this season. I do think the decision was made a little bit early, but, this is a time of uncertainty, so it's hard to place blame on anybody for making that call.
Yeah, I think it's one of them deals where there's not a wrong way of going about it. If you want to try to do non-conference, that's not wrong either if you can pull it off, and then doing conference only the same way. And, like you said, I know a lot of people, and I've seen people that maybe don't pay attention as closely. They look at it as, why are they trying to play? There's a pandemic going on. But I think a lot of people, and you mentioned it there, it's the financial side of it. It's not just about entertaining people or playing the games. There's a lot of jobs. And the other thing I think a lot of people hadn't realized until this come up, we look at college football across the board, how much the other sports at all these universities, at all these schools all over the country, they rely on football, because that money that's made by football is what helps the other sports have their seasons.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think the interesting aspect of this is it's easy to just look at this and say, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we can't play. But in a lot of cases, there are a lot of student athletes where if they're on campus, that's where they're going to get the best medical attention if they do get infected with COVID-19. And you look at, the opportunities that are out there for student athletes to get a free education. If you don't play college football this season, that could be wiped away, or at least a good portion of football scholarships could be off the board. And then the trickle-down effect, that's going to affect track and field. That could affect field hockey. That could affect baseball or softball or volleyball or whatever the case might be. So a lot of people like to look at this and say, these are amateur athletes, why are we forcing them to play? But when you look in the broader picture here, again, it's not just the money that's going into these conferences' pockets. That's going into scholarships. That's funding, medical teams and medical doctors where they can get, top-notch care. So there's a lot behind these decisions. It's not just a matter of, we don't want to play because it puts these student athletes at risk. That's obviously a big concern. But there's other concerns that could have consequences if they choose to just wipe away the season. And I think that that's what gets kind of swept under the rug during this whole situation. And like you said, there is no right or wrong answer right now, but it's a lot more complicated than just play or don't play.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And I wanted to transition, if we do have a season, because this is the fun stuff, what we would see on the field with these teams and looking at the Big Ten. I'm going to tell you what, when I was doing my prep work, just kind of looking over some of the teams, especially the teams you would expect to be at the top, quarterback, especially for teams at the top, that's pretty healthy position right now with the Big Ten. Of course, you got Justin Fields at Ohio State. You got Sean Clifford at Penn State. Wisconsin got a good Jack Cohn, and then Minnesota, Tanner Morgan's pretty solid quarterbacks at the top there for the Big Ten.
Yeah, and I think it could be one of the strongest position groups for the Big Ten Conference this season, and you got a lot of experience there too. And we didn't even touch on Adrian Martinez at Nebraska, and that's a kid who, after his freshman year, was considered a Heisman contender. Now, obviously, he endured a bit of a sophomore slump last season. And then look at Indiana and quarterback Michael Penix there with the Hoosiers. I mean, he was a guy who I believe was completing about 70% of his passes, helped lead the Hoosiers to an 8-win season until he got injured late in the year. So this is a really deep year in terms of quarterback play for the Big Ten. And even look at Illinois. You know, they've got Brandon Peters, who helped them get to a bowl game last season for the first time under Lovie Smith. And I think anytime any quarterback at Purdue under Jeff Brom, he's done masterful work there in his 3 seasons at the quarterback position. So regardless of who the quarterback is in West Lafayette, they're going to have a strong passer as well. So this is going to be a really fun year. I think that though Justin Fields is the far and away the top quarterback in that conference, and I think that it's not even close. So there's a big separation, a big gap between Justin Fields and the rest of the field. But I think, you know, Sean Clifford, Tanner Morgan, Adrian Martinez, some of those guys, it's really close, 2 through 14, who the best quarterbacks are in the Big Ten.
Yeah, well, I doubt, because, I mean, depending on which mock draft you look at, I mean, Justin Fields is number 1. I mean, of course, the other one's Trevor Lawrence as well. Those two are just 1 and 2 for both those guys, either way you look at it. And with Ohio State, of course, you know, you lose J.K. Dobbins, single-season rushing record at running back there, losing some receivers, offensive line. But it just feels like you've got a guy there in Justin Fields that can clean up a lot of stuff. And look, Ohio State's got plenty of talent. It's reload. It's not rebuild. It's just reload. When you look at this team, how far and away do you see this team perhaps? I mean, what's the gap between them and maybe the next team in the Big Ten?
Well, I'm actually going to surprise you, I think, a little bit here, because I don't think it's as far as what a lot of people are going to say. Because I think Penn State is really talented, and I think Penn State is really experienced. And I think if this was a given in any other year where you're going to play that game, the Ohio State Penn State game in October in front of a whiteout crowd in Happy Valley, I think Penn State would have potentially won that game. Obviously, the situation is going to be a little bit different there with a limit on capacity crowds. But you look at what Ohio State has offensively. Obviously, they've got a ton of talent at the wide receiver position with Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Julian Fleming's coming in. Justin Fields is a Heisman Trophy caliber quarterback. They've got an offensive line that could be just as good, if not better, than it was last season. But then you look at Penn State, they've got a returning starting quarterback. They've got a strong offensive line. Their backfield is absolutely loaded with guys like Journey Brown, Noah Cain, Devin Ford. So they've got a lot of explosive playmakers. And I think that Penn State might be even better defensively this year than they were a season ago with Jason Owe and Shaka Toney on the defensive end. Obviously, you got Micah Parsons, arguably the best defensive player in college football this season. So I think Ohio State obviously is still the favorite to win the Big Ten this year, but I really don't think Penn State is all that far behind.
You know, with Ohio State, and you kind of look at these teams in every conference, when you look at the favorite, like, okay, where are they weak at? And you talk about how good they could be offensively, and look, and they're going to be loaded talent-wise, I mean, on defense. But when you lose players like a Chase Young and a Jeffrey Okudah, can defense be a concern, you think, with Ohio State this coming up here?
I think so, but I think it's going to be along the front line. And that may sound a little bit weird because Larry Johnson, who had a ton of success as a Penn State defensive line coach and has had a ton of success in his time at Ohio State, and Ohio State, like you mentioned, you know, it's never rebuild, it's always reload. But when you lose a player, a generational talent like Chase Young, you wonder how you're going to replace them. Now, they've got some guys like Zach Harrison, Tyreek Smith, Jonathan Cooper. They've got some guys that can fill that gap. But I think that the gap between Chase Young and those guys is so big. I mean, you know, Chase Young's a guy who went to the NFL, and many expect him to be a Hall of Fame player, and he hasn't even taken a snap yet in the pro leagues. So I think that, you know, Ohio State's experience at the linebacker position is probably going to be as strong as it's ever been with guys like Tough Borland and Pete Werner, and their secondary has good players with Josh Proctor and Sean Wade. My big question is going to be, can they get as much pressure on the quarterback this season as they did a year ago? And, talent alone is going to win Ohio State a lot of games this year. It's going to come down to games against, teams like Wisconsin and Penn State and potentially even Michigan. I just don't think they're going to have the same pass rush as they did a season ago, but the secondary and linebacker position may make up for that. It's going to be one of the more interesting position groups, I think, to watch is that Ohio State defensive line to see how they progress without a guy like Chase Young. And don't forget Davon Hamilton, too, who was an NFL draft pick this past year as well. So they've got some reloading to do up front, but Larry Johnson has proven time and again that he doesn't need much time to get those guys ready for football season.
Yeah, you mentioned get pressure on a quarterback, and that's kind of jumping at Penn State, which you already mentioned how they got the playmakers on the team, and you got a quarterback in Sean Clifford. And I got to say, and I remember watching some games from last year, and I think for me, I guess on the national side of things, I'm sure he gets talked about locally, I don't think he gets enough credit as a mobile quarterback because he put some good numbers up last year, over 400 yards rushing, 5 touchdowns, along with his 23 touchdown passes and over 2,600 yards passing, about 60%. I mean, the total package with him, so he's not just a drop back passer. If need be, he can beat you with his legs too.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of that too is because of who his predecessor was, right? Like Trace McSorley was the do-it-all guy. He put up big numbers both with his legs and with his arm. And so I think what Sean Clifford did last season got overshadowed a little bit just because you're looking at who are you comparing him to? You're comparing him to guys like the guy who left him or left Penn State the year before, Trace McSorley. Then you're looking at a guy like, Justin Fields, who's just far and away the best quarterback in the Big Ten. Sean Clifford did have some trouble last season against some of the better teams that Penn State faced throwing the football, so I think that's why he probably doesn't get as much credit as maybe he deserves. But you got to remember, this was the first-time starting quarterback who came in what was supposed to be a rebuilding season for Penn State last year, and he helped lead them to 11 wins. So it's going to be interesting this year to see what he does as a second-year starter. And now remember, he's got Kirk Shiraka as the offensive coordinator who was at Minnesota last season and helped them win 11 games. So I think Penn State's offensive potential this year with Clifford being a second-year quarterback, you mentioned his mobility, a year with maybe a little bit better chemistry with his wide receivers this season, and a new offensive coordinator. I think Sean Clifford could take a Tanner Morgan-like jump from his first year to his second year as a starting quarterback there in Happy Valley.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one name we're going to get to in a minute here in Tanner Morgan. But before we leave the Big Ten East, there's a team I got to mention, the Michigan Wolverines, and I don't know, I guess sometimes whenever you do radio or podcasting, you bring up Jim Harbaugh, it can become a touchy subject for people. Of course, he hasn't beat Ohio State, has not won a Big Ten title there. I mean, and I'm not going to be one of these guys that says Jim Harbaugh's a bad coach. He is not. I mean, most people would take his record. I mean, what he's done. But last year, I guess going into the season that was supposed to be the year. Meyer's gone. He had a talented team coming back. Quarterback Shea Patterson, and what happened. Where do you see this Michigan program at right now? I mean, because they're not being talked about as contenders really in the Big Ten for this upcoming year. Usually I've been seeing third place in the East. So in your opinion, where is the Michigan program at for 2020?
Well, I think when you look at the program as a whole, I would say that it's healthy. It's as healthy as it's ever been in the past, 2 decades or so since they won their last national championship in 1997. Jim Harbaugh has brought consistency there. He's brought in really good recruits. Those recruits are getting drafted in the NFL, and that's really what you want to see. The one glaring omission is, as you mentioned, he's 0-5 against Ohio State, and that's really the problem in Ann Arbor. Because when you look at 3 10-win seasons and consistently a contender in the Big Ten East, there's a lot of teams that would be happy with that kind of success on the field. Heading into 2020 is interesting. I think they're going to take a step back and maybe look a little bit more like they did in 2017, a rebuilding year, because you are replacing Shea Patterson. You do have to replace a couple really good wide receivers in Donovan Peoples-Jones and Tarek Black, who transferred to Texas. You're basically replacing your entire offensive line. You've got some key defensive linemen who are gone. So to me, I'm looking more at Michigan and like, what can you do with this 2020 team? And it's going to be a tough job for Jim Harbaugh to win games this year, especially considering the level of competition is getting better in the Big Ten with teams rising like Indiana, And then you've got teams in the Big Ten West, obviously, with Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Purdue's getting better, Illinois is getting better. But I think the year you want to circle on the calendar for Michigan is going to be 2021, because that's going to be that's going to be Jim Harbaugh's next big opportunity to beat Ohio State. This year, I don't think they have the talent to compete at that level. I don't expect that they're going to be bad, but I think that they'll finish actually fourth in the Big Ten. I think Indiana is going to be better than Michigan this season. That's not what you want to hear from the Wolverines, but that's just how much talent they lost last season and how much of a rebuild they have ahead of them, I think.
When we, switch over to the Big Ten West, of course, Wisconsin's sitting there. I mean, the model of consistency, you can almost chalk them up. They're going to win 10 games. More than likely, they may end up in the Big Ten championship game. But I will say this, and I'm not meaning to knock the program, but it does seem they are really good against the West. But when they play the teams from the East, like Ohio State, Penn State, in those Big Ten championship games, and last year and I'll say this too, they had Ohio State in the ropes first half, up 21-7. Ohio State came back and beat them there in the second half in the Big Ten championship game. So when you look at Wisconsin, do you see them? Is this a team that maybe could, take that next step and maybe pull off an upset and be a playoff contender and be a contender to win the Big Ten overall?
I really don't think so this year. I know a lot of people have Wisconsin ranked as a top 10 team, a potential playoff contender, and I understand that, right? Like, how many times do we have to see Wisconsin win the Big Ten West to finally realize that they're going to be a good team year in and year out? But at the same time, when you look at all the talent that they lost, losing Jonathan Taylor, who was nearly a 3-year, 2,000-yard rusher, and who was really the heart and soul of that offense, they still have issues at quarterback. Yeah, Jack Cohn is an upgrade from Alex Hornibrook from a few years ago, but he still has some consistency issues. They lost their top wide receiver in Quintez Cephas. They lose a few good offensive linemen every year. I think Wisconsin is still going to be a contender in the West, but as far as being a contender in the college football playoff, I really just don't see it happening. Much like Michigan, I think they have too much to replace. And like I said, you're not going to be surprised if Wisconsin, I know the Big Ten's looking at a 10-game schedule now, but you won't be surprised if Wisconsin finishes with an 8-2, 9-1 record and then falls short in the Big Ten championship game. That's what you've come to expect under Paul Chryst and Wisconsin. But I just don't think that they have the talent to beat an Ohio. I don't think they have the talent or the speed, I should throw that in there, to beat an Ohio State or a Penn State this year.
So you look at also Minnesota, tremendous year last year, and as we talked about off the air, I cover right about Auburn for Last One College Football, so I got a good look watching the bowl game last year when they beat Auburn. Very impressive what they did in that game, because there were two teams last year that moved the ball in that Auburn defense. Alabama did, and Minnesota. Nobody else really did. I mean, even LSU had their worst offensive performance against Auburn with just 23 points. But with Tanner Morgan coming back, and then you got at receiver Rashad Bateman come back. I know they lost Tyler Johnson. The team looks like they should have staying power under P.J. Fleck and be explosive on offense once again.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest question going into the Big Ten West this year is Minnesota, what Minnesota did last year, is that sustainable, especially when you lose an offensive mastermind like Kirk Shiraka? And I think the answer is yes, because of the names you just mentioned. When you have Tanner Morgan, who's now been a starter for about a year and a half, when you have Chris Ottman-Bell, when you have Rashad Bateman, and you have Mo Ibrahim in the backfield. And don't forget that offensive line, a lot of those guys have played for 2 years now, and they're a big, they can bully you around. Daniel Fa'alele, Curtis Dunlap, Connor Olson, some of those guys up front. I mean, that's an imposing offensive line. So I think the interesting question to me for Minnesota is not can they score points. They're going to score points, and they'll score a lot of them this year. The question to me is, what are they going to look like defensively? Because you lost Antoine Whitfield, you lost Carter Coughlin, and those were two leaders defensively, not just in terms of talent and stats and what they brought to the team, but in terms of leadership and experience. So my question for Minnesota is not whether or not they're going to get to the end zone this year. It's whether or not they can keep other teams out of it. And if they can do that, they'll be a team that is going to be a challenger for the Big Ten West. And I think, honestly, that they would have a better shot at keeping up with an Ohio State or a Penn State next season than a team like Wisconsin, just because they have speed, they have offensive ingenuity, they have big bully offensive linemen up front. But again, the question's going to be, for me, can the Gophers keep teams out of the end zone defensively? And if they can, they've got a great shot to win a lot of games again this year.
Yeah, that's a team I look at, and like I said, I was really diving deep, reading up on them, looking at who they got. I'm excited just to watch them play. I love great offense. It's just, and I would love to see them in Ohio State really getting or Penn State getting one of them high scoring matchups. Anyways, my last question before I let you go. Now I've kept you over a couple of minutes longer than I said I would. If you look at this, and I know you mentioned Indiana, who you think could finish third in the East. Is there another team, not necessarily compete for the Big Ten title or division title, but is there a team in the Big Ten you could see being surprised this upcoming year that a lot of people maybe are not talking about?
Yeah, I think Indiana's a good starting point. I'll give you two teams here, and they're both from the same state. I think Indiana in the East is a team that has a lot of talent returning. If Michael Penix can stay healthy, that kid is as good of quarterback as you'll see in the Big Ten outside of Justin Fields, as I've talked about 4 or 5 times already. They've got some really good offensive talent. They need some work defensively, but a lot of their defensive starters do return, and they got a big transfer guy from Jovan Swan in the offseason who should help shore up that defensive line. So I think Indiana has the potential to be the third best team in the Big Ten. You're coming off of the Big Ten East, I should say. Coming off of a big 8-5 year, you had been ranked for the first time in 25 seasons. You hit 8 wins for the first time in 25 seasons. So I expect that they can have another big year. Maybe it's not another 8-2 or 8-3 season, depending on the schedule when that comes out. But they'll be a strong team to beat. And then I think Purdue is a team that you look at what happened to them last year. They endured injuries at the quarterback position. Rondale Moore was hurt. They had some of their best defensive players get injured. I think at one time they had 18 or 19 true freshmen or redshirt freshmen on the 2 deep. So there were a lot of guys who got a ton of experience last season. Jeff Brom, I think, is one of the smartest offensive minds and best quarterback coaches in the Big Ten. I don't think Purdue's going to make that jump like Minnesota did last season. I don't know that they're going to be the favorite or contend for the Big Ten West, but that's a team I expect to maybe get an upset this season, much like they beat Ohio State in 2018, and finish a little higher than what I think people are anticipating.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I look at Big Ten. I think this is going to be at the top. It's very interesting, and then the middle of the conference is also very interesting. Very good looking, from top to bottom conference going into this season. Hopefully, we do get that season. And Dustin, I do want to say I appreciate you coming on the show. Talk some Big Ten, and if the listeners want to follow you online, where can they find you and all your work you're doing at Saturday Tradition?
Yeah, if you want to hit us up, we're at Tradition on Twitter, or my personal account is at Schutte, SCHUTTE CFB, so at Schutte CFB. And then obviously SaturdayTradition.com. We cover all 14 Big Ten teams, primarily football, but we'll throw in basketball, baseball, and some other sports in there as well. So that's where you can find all of my stuff.
All right, sounds good, Dustin. And once again, I appreciate the time you coming on the podcast today, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime down the road.
Hey, it was a pleasure, Phillip, and thank you for having me on today.
Awesome conversation there with Dustin Schutte from Saturday Tradition, where he covers the Big Ten there as the managing editor. And as we were talking about in that conversation, the Big Ten a couple weeks ago made the announcement conference-only schedule. On Wednesday, the ACC came out with their plan, what they are wanting to try to do this college football season. Look, does it mean it's locked in that there's going to be a season? But as we're sitting here on July 30th, this is what they're looking to do. And very interesting with it because the Notre Dame aspect of this whole deal with what ACC is going to do. Notre Dame, at least for 2020, will be a football member of the Atlantic Coast Conference. And they will be able to compete for the ACC championship as well. So what the ACC is going to do, if anybody did not see, we're going to kind of go over some things right here. The season would start on the weekend of September 7th through 12th. Over 13 weeks, they'll play an 11-game season or scheduled 11 games. 10 will be conference, and the ACC is allowing 1 non-conference game. But the stipulation with that non-conference game, is the fact is that it has to be against a team within your own state. So if you are the Miami Hurricanes, you would have to play a game against another Florida team. The North Carolina schools, team's got to be in the state of North Carolina. So that's pretty much how that goes there. So that opens up on the ACC side of things to potentially keep those rivalry games against SEC opponents. When you look at the Georgia Tech game, South Carolina Clemson, Louisville Kentucky, and Florida State. So that's big. That's huge. And then there will be no divisions. It's going to be the best two teams with the best percentage in conference games that would play in the ACC Championship game that would be played in Charlotte on December 12th or 19th, giving some flexibility if you needed to move the game there. The Pac-12 seems like they haven't officially come out with their schedule, but that seems like from everything that's been speculated with the Pac-12, that is what they will be doing. This is key to here, and this was, I think, a big thing people were wondering. All TV revenue for 2020, including Notre Dame's home games on NBC, will be shared equally by all 15 schools. I mean, that's big because in this time, you're not going to have fans, more than likely. And if you do have fans, it's going to be very limited. If you do, revenue and money going around equally will be big because all these schools are going to need it. Because all these schools are going to lose money. That's just a fact. The NFL is going to lose money with no fans. It's not going to be the same money bringing in that you would normally get, of course. So that's a huge thing as well. Now, the dates for the actual games will be released later. They did release the 5 home games, the 5 away games, but not the actual dates where they would be input. Now, Clemson will play Notre Dame. And I got to think, coming in, Clemson and Notre Dame would be your favorites. Now, North Carolina, that's another team to look out for under year 2, under Mac Brown. Team showed some good things last year. They've got a lot of positive momentum going into this season. Very highly thought of in the preseason magazines. So that's another team. But on paper, you would think Clemson and Notre Dame, your 2 favorites. And Notre Dame may be a team that could give Clemson some trouble. We'll see how this Clemson team will look. So now you kind of look at that. Okay. Now, one, will this make Notre Dame become a full-time member of the ACC? I don't know. And could you say, hey, you have to now if we do this for you? Look, Notre Dame was already going to play 6 games against ACC opponents anyways, and Notre Dame needed this, and it really honestly helps the ACC out too, having that NBC money and having the brand of Notre Dame in your conference for this year. Let's see. If it goes well, Notre Dame likes it. Maybe Notre Dame joins the ACC as a full-time member in football. Remember, they are a full-time member in all the other sports. So now you look at it. Of course, we know the Big Ten and the Pac-12. They are playing conference-only games. But when you look at the ACC, we now know what they're doing. 10 conference games plus 1. What will the Big 12 and the SEC do? That's where we're kind of looking at things now. And I'm hoping by the time we get to next week, either Monday or Tuesday, when I release the next episode of the Phillip Jordan Football Podcast, we will have an idea of what those 2 conferences will do. The SEC is scheduled to hold a video conference on Thursday. Now, sources at Sports Illustrated, Ross Dillinger, put this article out that the SEC is moving towards a conference-only schedule. So that's why I kind of worded the way I did. From the ACC side of things, they can still pull off those rivalry games. But if the SEC goes with 10 conference games only, then that's out of question. And then I'll kind of wonder what the ACC will do for some non-conference games. Will the ACC just say, okay, we'll just throw that out. We're just going to play our 10 conference games as well. And that does hurt also the FCS schools, conferences that are playing, unless the NCAA may just cancel all championship events for the fall. And if they do that, FCS out the door, because for the FBS championship, the college football playoff, NCAA has no say-so over that. They do not crown a champion there. They do all other levels of college football, but they do not for them. And then, of course, you look at the group of 5. And I keep using Troy because Troy's right the road from me, an hour and a half from me. But they were scheduled this year to play at Tennessee. And they just lost the NC State game, too. NC State was actually going to travel to Troy early in the season. And then later in the year, Troy was going to go to Tennessee. So that's pretty much out of the question now. SEC goes to conference only, and then what the ACC did today, because they're not in the same state. So you couldn't have Troy, NC State play. So that's really going to hurt the big money games for those schools really need it. And we talked about that a little bit there with Dustin. that how much the money means to these programs. It's not just about entertaining fans, getting out on the field and stuff like that. It's also about people's jobs. There's a lot of money at stake here. And obviously, that's going to hurt the smaller schools with that. So that's what the sources, you're hearing that, Sports Illustrated is putting out what the SEC could do or might do. Now, when it comes to the Big 12, that's interesting too, because it's hard for them. They can't do a 10-game schedule because there's only 10 teams in the conference. You play a round robin, you get 9 games. So I wonder if some of the Group of 5 do play, will you see the Big 12 go to a +1 model where you do play your 9 conference games and then you play the 1 non-conference game? And then it's now being allowed where teams can move up and play August 29th. That's going to be allowed. And Oklahoma has already moved their game up with Missouri State to August 29th. On the schedule, go ahead and get that game going. You're in week 0. So now you kind of start your season off early, because it does seem like you're seeing a lot of teams maybe want to start in mid-September. I honestly think if you're so worried about later in the year, another wave, it getting worse, more outbreaks, get as many games in as early as you can, not later. And that's where if I was these conferences, I would be scheduling games on August 29th or as early as I possibly can. Maybe the Big 12 goes that route. I mean, you see Oklahoma's doing that, so that's intriguing there. And how the Big 12 goes about this. So I think just reading what I've read, different articles, different opinions, Big 12 kind of seems like they're waiting to see what the SEC does. And what the SEC does will obviously have an impact on the Big 12. But it kind of looks like the SEC is going to go to a 10 conference only. Then you get the ACC trying to do their +1 model, and I think the Big 12 would try a +1 model. But finding opponents for that non-conference game, I think that's going to be a tricky part for a lot of these teams. Another piece of news that has kind of come out this is not like one individual news item. This is just something that's been happening over the last couple of days. This is an NFL's topic. NFL players opting out. And this was something you had to expect happen. Didn't really see a lot of it. NBA, a few guys did it, but that's going into the bubble. So you would expect more guys or lesser guys to say, hey, I'm not going to participate because it's a safer environment. You did see it with Major League Baseball going into the season that guys are opting out because that's where you're traveling from stadium to stadium, stuff like that. And that's what you're going to get in the NFL. You're going to get it in college football as well. There's some college players that you're probably going to see opt out of the season as well. So several players, NFL players have it. I'm not going to sit here and read off the list of all the players that have announced, but there are some notable ones I'm seeing. I'm trying to look at this from a on-the-field perspective. How does it impact teams? Now, when you look at it from how they're feeling, I don't think it's right to kind of get too mad at them. Look, they're getting a stipend. This money they're going to have to technically pay back. So it's not like extra money they're getting. And a lot of people are out saying, well, I can't do this at my job. Look, I get it. Look, I can't either. My full-time job, I could just opt out because I don't feel safe. I mean, I could not go to work, but I'm not going to get paid for it either. But technically, these guys aren't getting paid either. They're getting a stipend, yes, but it's also money they're going to technically give back coming out of future salary. So that's that thing there. So it's not like players are getting extra money to just sit at home. They're not. They're going to give it back. But when I look through some of these, now I'll tell you what, I look at the Chiefs. Running back Damian Williams is one of them. And it's a good thing they drafted Clyde Edwards-Helaire because they're going to need that running back spot. Damian Williams is their starting running back. Yes, they were not a great rushing team really in the playoffs. I mean, I think Mahomes was as much as the running game as Damian Williams was in the playoffs. But they're going to need that running game. And it's a good thing they picked up Clyde Edwards-Helaire, which Pat Mahomes wanted, with Damian Williams to say, hey, I am going to opt out of here. Another one that really stands out to me, the Packers with wide receiver Devin Funchess. Devin Funchess is not one of the better receivers in the league. He's a solid option. The Packers didn't really do much to give Aaron Rodgers any help at the receiver position. So now with Devin Funchess announcing that he is going to opt out, it's pretty much bare bones after you get past Devontae Adams. But the big development here with the players opting out has always got to be the New England Patriots. 6 players from New England have opted out, and 3 of them are starters, big impact players. Safety Patrick Chung, linebacker Dante Hightower, offensive tackle Marcus Cannon. Well, that's big, protecting Cam Newton or Jarrett Stidham. And then Patrick Chung and Dante Hightower, these are leaders for Super Bowl winning teams not playing. And running back Brandon Bolden, back at running back. Fullback Danny Vitale, he is also one of them, and you'll see how that was going to. How much of him were they going to use with Cam in offense? Because I am curious to see how the Patriots offense does look differently if Cam's out there. So that's big. That's some big players for New England. And now I kind of say, how much of impact does that have on the team? Look, I've kind of stood by that Belichick's there. This team will be good because Belichick's the coach. He will find a way. I'm having my doubts now. Don't know what this team's going to be offensively. There's not a lot of talent around whoever's going to play quarterback. Now you see a couple of key defensive players also announcing they are opting out and are not going to be on the team this year. It kind of has my doubts for New England. But you're going to see more players. And that's another big thing with this. There's going to be more players announced that they're not going to participate in this upcoming season due to their own health reasons. If they have, little kids, family members that they don't want to get sick. So you're going to see players do this. It's just like you did with baseball, just like you did with the NBA, and you're going to see college football players do it as well. So just kind of, I think people need to brace themselves for this, that this is going to be part of it when you look at going into this upcoming college and NFL season. So we have to keep an eye, and I'll see you next week when I talk with you guys once again. We have more names to that list. Be interesting to see, something to keep your eye on as we move forward toward the hopefully of a football season coming up in September. Well, guys, I am going to get out of here. I hope everybody enjoyed this edition of the podcast. Hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dustin Schutte from Saturday Tradition, where he covers Big Ten football. That was a lot of fun talking with him. I hope to have him on the show at another point, talk more Big Ten football. Of course, you can follow me on social media at PJordanSEC. You can find a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. If you're on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe, rate, and review. It really means a lot if you do that. Leave a review, I will read it on a future edition of the show. Remember, you can always email me, sports.philipjordan@gmail.com. Hope everybody has a fantastic weekend. Have fun. Do safe things. Just wear a mask. It's very simple. Wear your mask. Have a good weekend. And I'll be back early next week. Haven't nailed down if it's Monday or Tuesday yet, but early next week, talk more football with you. Anyways, guys, till then, like I said, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you for checking out today's Phillip Jordan Football Podcast. Find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Contact Phillip on social media at PJordanSEC or email at sportstalkphilipjordan@gmail.com.